I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily, and it is usually at this point that I would take a minute or two to explain the story we're about to cover. Maybe mention some of the intricacies you'd need for a fuller understanding of the topic at hand. Well, today, I can do it in a single sentence. Rishi Sunak has apologised after he left the events commemorating the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings to record an election interview, prioritising an ITV journalist over the dwindling band of Second World War veterans still able to attend. You couldn't make it up. Here is Sky's Sam Coates speaking to the Prime Minister earlier.
Prime Minister, can you explain why yesterday you prioritised a campaign TV interview over the opportunity to commemorate those who gave everything for our country in June 1944? You left early. What were you thinking?
Over the past 2 days, I've participated in a number of events in Portsmouth and France to honour those who risked their lives to defend our freedom and our values 80 years ago. The itinerary for these events was set weeks ago, before the start of the general election campaign, and having participated in all the British events with British veterans, I returned home before the International Leaders event later in the day. On reflection, that was a mistake, and I apologise. I think it's important, though, given the enormity of the sacrifice made, that we don't politicise this. The focus should rightly be on the veterans who gave so much. I had the honour and privilege of speaking to many of them and their families, hearing their stories, expressing my gratitude personally to them. But I'm someone who will always admit when I've made a mistake. That's what you'll always get from me.
I have to say, Prime Minister, you sound more exasperated than apologetic. These men made the ultimate sacrifice, and you couldn't even sacrifice a whole afternoon. Ken Hay, a 98-year-old D-Day veteran, told us that you let the country down. Is he right?
I participated in events both in Portsmouth and in France over 2 days because this is an incredibly important moment for our country to commemorate the sacrifice of all of those and their service. And it was a real honour and a privilege to meet many veterans and speak to them and their families, hear their stories, express my gratitude to them, and build on our record of making sure that this is the best country in the world for veterans.
Yep, it is all a bit of a mess, which makes it rather handy that we have standing by our chief political correspondent, Jon Craig, a man who would never put his foot in his mouth. Jon, let's start with the basics. What do we know about what happened yesterday with the Prime Minister and those D-Day commemorations?
We've known for days that political leaders, world leaders, veterans, military people were going to be in France for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And anybody planning an election campaign would have said to the party leader, whether it's Sir Keir or Mr Sunak or any other party leader, look, we've got to take part in the D-Day celebrations or commemorations, I beg your pardon, because it's the right thing to do. And so he really ought to have cleared his diary for that day, because it was such an important day. Sir Keir Starmer was there, Nigel Farage was there. He said he was there in a personal capacity because he believed it was the right thing to do. So it's a big, big, big day. And there are plenty of occasions during general election campaigns when some major international event has happened and the Prime Minister of the day has gone off, whether it's an international summit or some big anniversary like this. And the Prime Minister's behaviour here was just crass in the extreme. Now, as the day unfolded, we didn't realise the seriousness of the situation because he was present in the early part of the day and, in fact, he did a reading. But what we now know is that he slipped out at about 12 local time, 11:12 here, and was back in London. He got back about 3 o'clock and then recorded an interview, an election interview. But we didn't know. I must admit, I didn't know that he'd slipped out early until, of course, we learned about this ITV interview, which in actual fact was not a live interview.
No, it wasn't.
Not an interview to be broadcast last night, but an interview for next Wednesday. And it was only when ITV released a short part of the interview in which the PM was hitting back at Sir Keir Starmer's accusations of lies about Labour tax policy that we realised he'd actually done an interview. So he leaves President Biden, President Macron, and hundreds, if not thousands, of veterans, many of them in wheelchairs, high and dry in Normandy, to come back to do some electioneering. It couldn't be worse. It's dreadful. This is crass, insensitive, bad planning, bad politics. It's a disaster for the Prime Minister.
Oh, but John, tell us what you really think. No, John, the Prime Minister has now apologised. He's acknowledged that he made a mistake. Surely that is the end of the matter. Oh no, wait a minute. Whilst he was apologising, he asked us all to stop politicising his decision to leave the D-Day commemorations and go and record a political interview.
A political interview in which his main thing he wanted to do clearly was to attack the Labour Party over their tax plans. It all goes back to Tuesday night up in Salford. It was the debate between Mr Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer, which at the time we all thought, those of us who were there, I was there, we all thought Mr Sunak had done pretty well. He came out fighting, went on the attack, attacked Sir Keir on Labour's plans, claiming that people were going to be £2,000 worth off. Sir Keir was flat-footed, didn't really respond, and it was the next day, Wednesday, when Labour came out fighting themselves, with Rachel Reeves leading the fight back, saying he was telling lies, and Sir Keir then joined in that. And clearly, Mr Sunak wanted to hit back at that allegation, and presumably that's why there was an agreement with ITV that bit of the interview could be put out on Thursday evening.
Going back to Rishi Sunak's explanation of events, doesn't it make it worse that they had this plan in the diary for weeks, that no one over the course of those several weeks, we must assume, given that they've used the plural, no one in his team, his massive team of advisors, went, do you know what, hold on a second here, Prime Minister, you sure about this?
You say massive team of advisors. When I went up to Manchester on, Tuesday afternoon, that was about lunchtime, I was in Coach H. The PM's party were all in Coach J, which was first class.
Obviously.
And they filled the entire carriage. It was a massive entourage. And as some people have said about some of these intellectuals, lots of brains but no common sense. Now, the significance is, who called the election for July the 4th and caught everybody off guard? The PM knew the election was going to be on July the 4th. Keir Starmer didn't. You and I didn't. None of the opposition parties, and nearly every Conservative MP I've spoken to didn't know. So the PM knew that D-Day was going to come during the election campaign. He could have said to his aides, right, OK, when we're planning the grid, as they call it in the jargon, you need to keep those days of the D-Day anniversary, keep those absolutely clear, because I've got to be there. I'm the Prime Minister representing our country. But oh no, he just turned up. Now, some people have made various comparisons about this. One is with Gordon Brown many years ago when he was Prime Minister.
At this point, I have to interject and remind people who are perhaps not of a certain age, like you and I, that I was the Sky political correspondent on that story on that day, chasing after Gordon Brown. But remind everyone what the story was, John. My story.
You can tell the story of what happened, but I remember it was the day before the last of the 3 television debates in 2010. And there were 3 that year. There was ITV, Sky News, and then BBC. It was the day before the BBC one.
Indeed.
And Gordon Brown had to issue a grovelling apology at the beginning of the BBC debate. Anyway, Neil, I know you're supposed to ask the questions, but over to you, Neil. Tell us what happened in Rochdale.
Gillian Duffy went out to the shops, got waylaid by a group of journalists. She got, what's going on here? She'd just gone to pick up a loaf, went over, had a long chat with Gordon Brown. Everyone, to a man and a woman that was covering the election, looked at what happened, said, what a wonderful exchange. Gordon Brown dealing with real people, dealing with their concerns. The unfortunate thing was, of course, Gordon Brown had got back into his prime ministerial car, still wearing the microphone that I had given him, and we overheard him describing this lady as a bigot, and it really did rebound on him. But I suppose, though, John, you make the point that this is worse for Rishi Sunak. I think back to that election, it really didn't shift the polls. The Labour were down to core vote by that point. This time around, I would suggest again, I'm not sure we're going to see a massive swing as a result of this.
But let me tell you why this is worse than Gillian Duffy. That was a thing that happened spontaneously, just a brief error by Gordon Brown and his team, leaving his microphone on as he got into a car. I must admit, we've all perhaps done it after broadcasting, perhaps left the earpiece in, left the mic on. This mistake. The reason it's so much worse, this was bad planning. It wasn't a spur of the moment thing. I mean, one assumes he didn't just suddenly decide at, 12, whatever it was, oh, right, come on, I'm leaving now. But he clearly had always planned to leave at lunchtime. And it was terrible planning. It was disrespectful, unpatriotic, according to political opponents. And it's a real slur and a snub and a disrespect to all those veterans. I thought Sir Keir Starmer's response, he didn't really twist the knife. He was quite prime ministerial. And of course, they're delighted that he's been shown in pictures with President Zelensky and people like that.
Indeed.
But what he said was, think about all these veterans. I mean, you and I will have watched the pictures from Normandy. Some of those chaps are really, really, really old, aren't they?
Yeah.
And many of them were in wheelchairs. Sir Keir was making the point that it had been stressful for them. Now, I tell you what I thought was telling in the TV pictures. In the afternoon, the pictures with a rather sheepish-looking Lord Cameron alongside Macron, Chancellor Scholz of Germany and President Biden. Cameron must have been thinking to himself, oh my goodness, the PM should be here. This is what I used to do a few years back when I was PM. What must Biden, Scholz and Macron have thought?
Yeah.
That the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom couldn't be bothered to stay for the afternoon commemorations and all the very moving displays.
Something as fundamental as this. A Prime Minister on, again, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, a pivotal moment in this nation's history, leaves early, having just a couple of days before told teenagers that they might have to be signed up for a year of national service.
I know, some people have said he only had one day of national service to do. I wonder what Lord Cameron and Mr Shapps must have thought. The plane that brought him back then went back to collect Lord Cameron and Mr Shapps later on in the day when it had all finished. So that's a waste of fuel and your carbon footprint and all that jargon. So that's yet another thing. But I mean, they get the King's Flight, as it's now called. They've got those sort of mini jets that take them to these sort of things. But I mean, you could argue, I suppose, if he was coming back for a political event, he shouldn't have used a government plane. But that's a minor point.
in a field full of, I would suggest, some pretty major ones. Jon Craig, for now, thanks very much indeed. Clearly, so much more to say on this topic. In a moment, we will be back with a pollster and a former Tory special advisor to see if anyone can make sense of what looks set to be one of the defining moments of this general election. Back soon. Welcome back. There are moments which come to define elections. Ed Miliband and that bacon sandwich, Gordon Brown and that bigoted woman, as he of course described Gillian Duffy. Now we add to the list Rishi Sunak choosing to leave his foreign secretary at the D-Day commemorations, whilst he flew home to pre-record an election interview. Two questions therefore present themselves. First and foremost, what on earth did he think he was doing? And second, will it have any effect on the polls? Well, we're joined now by Joe Twyman from pollsters Deltapoll, also Claire Pearsall, former Conservative special advisor, now Conservative commentator. Guys, good to see you both. Claire, you first. What the hell do you make of this?
You know, when you go into a campaign and it starts off a little badly and you think, well, it can only get better from this point, and then this happens. And I had my head in my hands when all of this came up. Who on earth decided that the Prime Minister could leave early from D-Day celebrations with a whole load of veterans, other world leaders, just because an interview was booked with another broadcaster? I mean, it is really, really basic stuff that veterans comes first, especially when you're centering your election campaign around defence spending. Yes, we've had an apology. We should obviously have an apology, but it shouldn't be necessary because you should have just stayed put.
Joe, your take on events, because as Claire was saying, this is a Conservative Party that's standing on a patriotic platform that is making an awful lot out of their ability to defend the nation.
Rishi Sunak and his party have specifically been aiming for older voters in this election. A lot of the policies that they announced are specifically at older voters who tend to lean more towards Conservatives. And so this is their core base. And this is in many ways an open goal. And then we have the more wide issue, if you like, about competence generally. Rishi Sunak is there because of competence. He has freely admitted that he's not the most charismatic leader compared to what has gone before, but he presents himself as in terms of stability and in terms of competence. And this just adds to the questions around his competence that already exist. And that's certainly not something that you want when you head into a general election.
So who then do we blame for all of this, Claire? I mean, I asked the question this morning on social media, who is advising the Prime Minister now? And plenty of people, to give them their due, came back and said, well, who does it matter who's advising the Prime Minister? He's the one that makes the decisions. But there is a reason that you have a team of people there around you at all times to gently point out when you are about to go off a cliff.
Well, that's right. The ultimate responsibility is that of the Prime Minister. It's really unclear as to whether it was suggested to him or he made that suggestion. But either way, a group of people sitting around in number 10 should have said, hang on a minute, should we just understand what the implications are of you coming back? It is a really big deal. We mustn't forget that people laid down their lives for this country. And you've got a Prime Minister sort of saying, thanks very much, I need to be out of here. So it does beg the question as to the calibre of individuals that he's got around him.
I mean, Joe, even if we just park the general election for a moment, there is an awful lot of pressure coming in Rishi Sunak's direction from the right of his party, that part of the party that likes to think of itself as traditionalist, as patriotic. When you throw reform into the mix, I mean, this is manna from heaven for those who would wish to restructure conservatism and the right wing of politics.
That's absolutely right. It provides an enormous stick with which to beat Rishi Sunak specifically and the Conservative Party more generally. Ahead of the commemorations, I was actually expecting the opposite to happen, that criticism would come in for Rishi Sunak for him spending too long there, because I thought it's inconceivable that he would leave early, and instead would try to milk it for every last drop that was possible for precisely the reasons that you've articulated. But it proved to be the opposite. And though I don't think this particular incident will have a massive impact on the polls, every day that something like this happens, there's the opportunity cost to explore. Because if we're talking about this, we're not talking about something the Conservatives want us to be talking about.
Joe, what effect do we think this might have electorally? I mean, obviously, clearly, there will be those in Conservative ranks at the grassroots who might not be as keen to go out campaigning. There are a number of seats which you would describe as marginal in parts of the country where there is a big military presence. I'm thinking Bracknell, Aldershot, Portsmouth North, places like that. I mean, it's going to have an effect.
Well, it's worth pointing out that around a third of people historically make up their mind during the election campaign. They make up their mind whether they're going to vote or not. They make up their mind about which party they're going to vote for. So things are still very much in play, and every vote counts and every constituency counts. And even if the Conservatives are to lose, I'm sure that Rishi Sunak would want to minimise those losses as far as possible. The difficulty that he has is that individual events, even some like this, probably don't have too much of an impact. But the cumulative effect is what is most damaging. Essentially, when you look back on previous elections, the party that is ahead on leadership and the party that is ahead on economic competence wins the most seats of the election. That's happened at every election since polling began. And so really that's the game. You get those two, you win. Rishi Sunak has been behind Keir Starmer on leadership the entire time that he has been Prime Minister. But that gap, if anything, has been growing. In our most recent polls at Deltapoll, Keir Starmer has a net rating of +8. That means 8% more people think he's doing a good job than a bad job. For Rishi Sunak, the net score was -31. An enormous gap. And with so little time, relatively speaking, remaining, everything has to be done to try and close that gap. And most people out there probably won't be paying precise attention to the detail. But the growing narrative around competence, or rather lack thereof, when it comes to Rishi Sunak, is only going to make his situation more difficult.
I mean, Claire, should people advising the Prime Minister not have the optics at the very top of their list?
If we go back to the announcement of the general election, where you had a very soggy Prime Minister standing in Downing Street in the rain with music blasting out from the other end of the street. And then you move on to photographs of him on an aeroplane by an exit sign, in a factory with Disney Mickey Mouses appearing over his head. But if you're advising somebody, those are the things, really basic things that you look out for. What is in the background? Who are the people around them? What could possibly be thrown into a photograph that you don't want there? What do you want the main focus to be? You look at all of those things. It isn't difficult. And that's what I don't understand, is why nobody said, well, hang on a minute, that's not a good frame for a photograph. Let's just move you around, turn you around 90 degrees, job's done. So the people around him have started badly, and it's almost like they've given up.
I mean, when we have the Veterans Minister, Johnny Meosa, of all things, describing this as a significant mistake, I wonder if we might conclude by asking just a very straightforward question of both of you. I mean, Joe, you first. Is Rishi Sunak rubbish at politics?
Rishi Sunak is not nearly as good as he needs to be at politics. I think that is the answer. Some of this has simply been bad luck. You can't legislate for the fact, for instance, that it's going to rain when you're announcing the election. But if you're perhaps better at politics, you might look back and realise that there's no need to announce the election on the street outside Downing Street. It can be done anywhere you want to, as indeed Tony Blair and previous prime ministers have done. And so you can control for some things, you can't control for others. And it appears that the Rishi Sunak manages to pick the worst option in whatever the choice may be. And so does that make him bad at politics? As I say, it's not as good as he needs to be.
I mean, Claire, your views? I mean, the thick of it, that political satire, there are many phrases we can use. Catastrophe, well, maybe not that one, but omni-shambles is one that we can introduce before the watershed. What is your view? Is it just simply the case that Rishi Sunak is awful at this side of the job?
The problem with Rishi Sunak is he's incredibly clever. He's one of those intellectual types and is very good at the treasury side of life. When you are a leader, you need to understand that your party is probably actively trying to get rid of you at any one point, especially the Conservative Party. So he's not particularly good at those interpersonal relationships, the internal politics of Westminster. He has really not had enough time in the job to understand quite how that place works. And I think that he needed to be much, much better. It's all very well to have some great ideas and be very clever in one area, but if you can't manage to deal with internal wranglings and thinking on your feet, then he really needed to have left it for a few more years before he tried to be the leader of the country.
Claire Pearsall, Joe Twyman, lovely to see both of you. Thanks very much for your time. Politicians are not infallible. Much as we hate it when it happens, they can and do make honest mistakes. Yet despite the PM's protestations to the contrary, this was not one of those. This was a deliberate choice, and one, according to the Prime Minister himself, made weeks ago. There was ample time for someone, anyone in Number 10, to realise that prioritising a political interview over honouring the sacrifice of our servicemen wasn't just a bad look, it would be seen and taken as an insult to their memory. Rishi Sunak will find it difficult to recover from this. After all, what does it say about his commitment to remaining Prime Minister when he seemingly finds it difficult to understand what the job actually involves? That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you again next week.